Welcome to another episode of Relentlessly Resilient, where real people share real life experiences and the tools they've developed to move forward and live their best life. I'm Michelle Scharf.
And I'm Jennie Taylor. Now, Michelle, today we have a wonderful guest with us, my good friend Craig Wilhelm, who is joining us. He's got a history with the Army, with the National Guard. He's got a great story that's a heartbreaking but also heart-inspiring story, and I'll let him tell that. We want to welcome you, Craig, and thank you for joining us today. I know today you're traveling. You're from Oregon, but in Boston, and we're grateful that you would make time for us in the middle of your meeting. So quick heads up to any of our listeners, if you hear some background noise, it's because Craig is busy today, and he is working us in between some meetings, and you'll hear a little bit of background at the conference where he is in the lobby. So, Craig, thank you for joining us and making time in your busy travel schedule to share this really important story as we get close to Memorial Day.
Well, thank you, Jennie and Michelle, and I'm happy to be on with you all, particularly because we definitely share in loss, and different kind of loss for sure, but how we processed it and continue to process it, I think, is really important for your listeners, and I'm humbled and grateful to be on with both of you.
Yeah, I love what you've done. I'm sorry for what you've been through. Just for our listeners to know, I first met Craig at the beginning of the pandemic, actually as Italy was experiencing the beginning of the coronavirus, and America was still kind of watching from a distance, thinking how crazy that's happening in Italy. Craig and I were both in Washington, D.C. as part of the civilian aid to the Secretary of the Army program. He serves as a CASA in Oregon. I serve as a CASA here in Utah. That's what that acronym is. And we were at a training. It was the first time I met Craig. Now, at that training, a lot of CASAs have prior military service, and it's always humbling for me to be in the presence of veterans who have served, who have given so much to their country, most who have deployed to combat zones more than one time. And what really immediately drew me to Craig was just his kindness, his overall demeanor, but the fact that his story involves losing not family members in military service, but his brothers in arms. And Craig, before we jump into that story, let me just thank you again publicly for the work that you do for families like mine who have lost someone in combat, and also express my sorrow for you. The loss is yours too. Like you said, it's a different loss. Maybe you're not biologically connected to the soldiers that died that day, but they're your family, and that loss is heavy on the service member as well. So can I get a little background on you? Can you tell us about you, your family, what drove you to the Army in the first place? And let's maybe get a little backstory before we jump into the day of that event.
Yeah, so I was drawn to military service from a young age. I knew at 13 that I wanted to join the military, particularly the Army, and I was drawn to West Point and was lucky enough to get into West Point and started my Army career after graduating from West Point. I went Army Aviation, and so spent many years flying helicopters for the U.S. Army and making my, officership transition between jobs to command a unit in Afghanistan. And that's what happened 17 years ago this April, on April 6th of 2005, while I was commander of the unit. One of my unit's Chinook helicopters went down in Afghanistan, killing 5 of our crew. Those were the 5 that I knew because they were my direct reports, and 13 passengers who I did not know because they were hopping the ride or were assigned to the day to fly on our aircraft. And in that tragedy, there were no survivors. Windy 25, W-I-N-D-Y 25 was the call sign of the aircraft. And as the unit commander, there was over 280 soldiers in the unit. Certainly it was a devastating blow, not only for the families, were an instant and life-changing experience for them, but we definitely, had to face staying focused on the mission and staying focused in combat.
Yeah, Craig, back up for a second. Tell me, how long had you all been in theater at the time of this incident, and how much longer was the deployment after? I'm trying to get a timeline for what you've just mentioned.
Yeah, no, it's a good question. So I want to even take you back a little bit further because that's sort of where our headspace was. So I had taken command in Iraq, and so I was the commander in Iraq for about 8 months before we redeployed from Iraq to our home station in Germany. And then 11 months later, in January of 2005, we ended up deploying back to Afghanistan. So from January through April, it was a very short time before the accident happened. The unit was going to be in Afghanistan till the following February.
Okay, so I might have misspoken. Were you there with the National Guard or were you there with active duty?
Active duty.
Okay, yes. I apologize for that. I guess I had thought it was National Guard. So you had been deployed, you and your men, pretty rapidly between the two different countries and those two different assignments. If you're in Iraq for those 8 months and then back to Germany as your home base, what you said, and then less than a year later you're off to Afghanistan, was that common at that time? 2005 is pretty early into both conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan. Was it common to have such a fast turnaround?
It was fairly common in the aviation community, and partly because limited number of assets and the requirement for so many aviation assets in theater. So, yes, it is fairly common.
Okay, that's a fast pace. Can you tell us, what does it day-to-day look like? Let's back up again. You're on this deployment. You've been there since January. What did day-to-day look like for you and your men January, February, March? What is an aviation unit task? And just what do you do? I think a lot of our listeners have seen movies of the military, or maybe some of them have a connection to the military, but most of us just know you deploy, you put on a uniform, and you go to work all day. What does that work all day look like in the aviation community?
You might have experienced this with Brent deploying so many times to Jennie, but there is a train-up period as well. So you deploy early, you train up with the units that you are going to transfer out with. So we were hooked up with the aviation unit that we were taking over for. Their mission was going to wind down, and then we were going to pick up the mission. So during that transition phase between January and, frankly, even into April, we were working those transitions, taking over more of the missions from that unit so they could transition out of theater.
Okay, and are those missions, can you say much about what the nature of those missions was? I obviously don't want to get into any trouble with things that maybe can't be shared.
With the Chinook helicopter, we are the large transport aircraft. We had a variety of missions during that time, and throughout the time we were in theater. They would range from missions of picking up passengers that were leaving theater or transitioning from base to base or camp to camp within the forward operating bases that we served at in Afghanistan. It would be resupplying like far out locations with water, equipment, food, the standard supply issues we would resupply them with. And then we would also perform air assaults because of the mission of being so high up in altitude in Afghanistan. A lot of times the Chinooks were used for insertion and extraction of troops into the fight. And so we did a lot of different types of missions, even during that transition period where we were picking up from the other unit.
So that's a lot. I mean, that's a varied nature between the air assaults, the transportation of people, the transportation of goods and supplies.
Yeah, you don't really think about the transport also doing combat mission.
Right, but it sounds like you guys did. And a Chinook, for all of our listeners, please go to our social media pages or look at the show notes. We'll share some pictures of what the Chinook looks like. We've, of course, got the Chinook and the Apache are kind of those two different helicopters. But so you can see, Craig called it the large transport aircraft. This is a large aircraft. I have a couple pictures of my husband outside of a helicopter where he would have been one of the soldiers maybe needing a ride from you guys. One of the assignments he had as a major at the time of his final deployment, he needed to move around from these smaller bases one to the other. And the terrain in Afghanistan, there's not a great I-15 that you just jump on and drive your car down. And so he often was transported by these helicopter rides, and they'd pick him up and fly him wherever and drop him off and back and forth. So can you tell us, Craig, on the day of that incident, that April 6th day, maybe back us up to the beginning of the day, what was the mission that day, and then tell us about the tragedy and what went wrong with that aircraft or what caused its demise.
Yeah, so it was a standard mission day. We had probably 12 aircraft on mission that day from our unit. We had 19 aircraft in our unit. The Windy 25 aircraft, along with a sister aircraft, were on a resupply mission and a relief in place mission. And what that means is that we were resupplying forward operating bases within our area of operation in the northern part of Afghanistan. And we were also picking up passengers that were coming out of combat to go home to their families, which is, certainly gut-wrenching as far as the tragedy goes. Not that, every tragedy is bad and loss is bad, but, the fact is that they
were on their way home.
They were on their way home, yeah. So that it also adds to the tragedy itself.
All right, so what happened? You said it was a standard mission day. Was it a typical start to the day? Were you, obviously you were not on Windy 2-5, were you on the ground as the commander? Did you get in the aircraft often, or did you kind of operate from the ground?
So I, as a commander, got into the aircraft often. That was one of the days that I was not on an aircraft.
Okay.
Again, like I said, we had 12 aircraft operating. So it was a pretty standard day from mission standpoint, but it was a very unusual day from a weather standpoint. So the weather forecast appeared to show that there was going to be some storms passing through. And so we paid particular attention to those when we got our weather briefings, and our pilots were trained to determine whether or not there was any risk level associated with that weather. And it just so happened that during that morning, I received quite a bit of interaction with pilots where they had to tell me that the weather was getting bad and make a determination on whether they were going to continue on with their mission or divert the mission to something else. So I was up early that day with the pilots. I was out on the airfield going aircraft to aircraft to talk with the pilots about their mission subsets and whether or not the weather was going to impact that and whether they were going to be able to complete the mission as planned. So that was sort of where the unusual part, but it was quite frankly not unusual to the aviation community. It's just something that we did and made sure that the weather briefings that we got were legal to fly during that time.
Okay, we're going to take a pause right now and go to a quick break. When we come back, I want you to walk us through what happened from that morning and then through the rest of that day. We'll be right back. All right, Craig, so I'm sure with these weather briefings, there's got to be a certain amount of risk analysis where you can't keep the helicopters on the ground every time there's a teeny bit of wind or every time there's a little bit of something weather. It sounds like you had your weather briefings discussing with the different pilots. You've got 12 different aircraft in the air. What happened with the Windy 2-5, and were the other 11 aircraft that day safe?
Yeah, so when the aircraft took off, all of the aircraft, all 12 took off. Windy 2-5 was with another aircraft, so a flight of two. And they, again, like I said, were going to forward operating bases around the northern area of operation, really just like a resupply mission and picking up those passengers, as I said earlier, to go home. So once we had the legal weather, we did our risk assessments based on that weather. We launched the fleet. And about 10:30 local time in Afghanistan, I had one of my pilots who had just come back from a resupply mission himself with another sister bird. I was walking to a meeting, and he ran up to me and said, I think we have a problem. Windy 2-5 has lost communication, and something you don't want to hear as a commander, certainly. So my first sergeant and I ran to the Tactical Operations Center for our brigade, and that's when we heard the news that Windy 2-5 was indeed down. What had happened is there was a flight of two. They were in the area of Ghazni, Afghanistan, and there was a sandstorm that came out of nowhere. It happens usually once every 20 years. It's called the Shamal in those parts of the world, where it's a wall of sand that's drummed up by high winds that goes from the surface of the earth to, in this case, about 15,000 feet. And they experienced disorientation, and the aircraft went into the ground. Again, there were no survivors. Everybody perished in that accident. Luckily, Windy 2-7, which was the call sign of the aircraft that was their sister aircraft, was able to perform the maneuvers that we are trained to perform and was able to get back to base safely. So all other 11 aircraft that were out that day were safely back in station when we heard the news that Windy 2-5 had gone down.
Oh, my goodness. So, Craig, tell me, the moment you knew they lost communication, then you found out the bird was down. Did you know instantly there were no survivors? Walk us through maybe those first few minutes as a commander. What is in your mind? What happens, and what that experience was like?
So the first experience, and again, this is 17 years ago, so forgive me if I miss some details, but the first thing in my mind was, are there any survivors? And so that's the first thing you want to determine, right? And hopefully that all of them are safe and sound, and
Sure.
then we can bring everybody home. But we did get some picture feeds into the Tactical Operations Center, and it didn't look very good for survivors. And then we had some Afghan folks that had been reporting to the nearest base that said that an aircraft had gone down and that there were no survivors. And so we were just trying, as you can imagine, in the fog of war, you need to fleece out and make sure that you have the facts correct. And that's what we were trying to do. So it was really sort of, unfortunately, emotion is certainly there, of course, but, the adrenaline and the command focus kicks in. And, the real focus was, can we get our folks home? And what was the truth on the ground of what was going on. So that's what our immediate focus was on. And then once we found out that there were no survivors, or at least there didn't seem to be, then the idea of going to the site and making sure that we account for everybody and can bring them home to their families.
What did that look like? What's that process? Explain it to me. I'm completely civilian, don't understand how this all works. Like, is it a hot area? Is a war going on down there? You've got the sandstorm. Has it cleared out? I mean, I'm thinking.
And how far away were they from where you were? Were you able to go? Right. I agree with Michelle. Yeah. What level of difficulty was it to then actually physically get to the site rather than just wait on the reports from those who were already near?
So we had to wait about a day and a half to get to the site ourselves because the weather was so bad. We did have a unit that was in the vicinity drive out to secure the area because, Michelle, that's a very good question. We do treat it as a combat area, obviously it was. And so we had to make sure that the area was secure and that the enemy, the elusive enemy in that case, is Taliban, but also some other factions that were sympathetic to the Taliban at the time, were in that area. So we had to make sure that the area was secure. So all of that sort of fell into place based off of the mission set that was going on and the availability of units that were available to secure the area. So once we flew out as an aviation asset, it was not close enough to where we were at in Bagram, Afghanistan. We had to fly out. It's about a 30-minute flight from Bagram. We went to the crash site. We shut down our aircraft, and then we helped the mortuary affairs folks that were able to drive down to that location and bring everybody home.
Okay, Craig, I have to ask. Obviously, you're part of a unit. How many did you say were in your total unit on this deployment? It was a couple hundred, right?
280.
So you're almost 380. It's a day and a half before you're able to go retrieve the bodies. What's the casualty notification process like for those families? Do you know, were they able to be notified once you could determine from a distance there were no survivors? Could you not notify families at home until you had eyes on the bodies? Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, I can. And Jennie, you can appreciate this because I know we sit on a casualty assistance working group to make sure that the Army stays right on the way that we do these sort of notifications. But the short answer is there is a time lag. The Army wants to make sure that they get it right, that everybody is accounted for in that flight that went down, and that we can make sure that we can positively identify that before the families are notified. So there was about a 3-day period before the families were notified of their loved one's death. And we were not able to communicate back to our rear detachment or our families because all communications were shut off because there was concerns, rightly so, that we got this right, that we didn't tell somebody erroneously what had happened.
Right.
But in that same vein, imagine families who didn't know if their loved one was dead or alive, and certainly soldiers that knew where we were, that it was very likely that they were gone.
Yeah,
and then having to continue a mission based around that information.
Yeah, I can't. I mean, you say imagine that, and my head just spins and my stomach falls. Now in my new world as a military widow, I've met a lot of other military surviving families, and some of them have shared stories where they knew something had happened in their unit, but they didn't yet know what. And like you said, it's easy for an outsider to point fingers and say, oh, how could you take so long for the Army to notify? But I appreciate what you said, that they're not going to notify until they have accurate information. We all know how the rumor mill and social media and even mainstream news stories can get it wrong. The day Brent died, I remember a friend had, she said she had drifted off to sleep with the TV still on, and then she kind of woke up in the middle of the night and she saw a report that there was a casualty from a Utah military member, but it hadn't been identified or who or what. And of course, that was hours before I was officially notified. And then technically, military protocol, it's supposed to be another 24 hours after all of the family members know before the media announces anything publicly. But again, in today's world of communication being what it is, it's hard to... those 3 days must have been horrifically long to you and every one of those families.
Yeah, it is, but it's certainly, like you said, I think while it's not ideal, it's not perfect, I think we owe it to the family members to get it right. And so, I wish there was a better way, and maybe there is, and maybe we'll be able to figure that out, Jennie, you and I, in that working group. But I think it's important we give it the importance of it, and we also acknowledge that we have families that are and will be suffering for years to come. And so let's get it right the first time and not add to their suffering.
Absolutely.
Or their loss.
Absolutely.
So, it was difficult, certainly. And you talk about the rumor mill and social media. We also had a 24-hour news cycle at the time. And CNN, while I was in the Tactical Operations Center, so, hours after the accident, they were reporting that it was my unit.
Oh, my goodness.
And so that also added to the
panic back home.
And,
yeah.
Yeah. And gosh, I can't imagine what the families, certainly the families that suffer the loss, but that, unknown and waiting period also has to be so terrifying and horrific for families of the military. So, I think that's the importance of making sure that a rear detachment command is so trained and ready, God forbid if anything like this happens. But I think that's really important, for the families.
Yeah, and just for our listeners who might not know that term, rear detachment would be basically your unit back home, where
right.
A group of your unit that's not deployed, and because obviously the families are not deployed with you. So when Brent was deployed, I was back with the rear detachment, and if something happened, that would be my communication channel. Now, Craig, over the year and a half or so that Michelle and I've had this podcast, we've interviewed several military survivors, several spouses, parents. We've heard those horrific stories of what it's like back home to get a knock on the door from Army officers or whichever branch dressed in those beautiful, horrifying dress uniforms. We've not ever asked a commander who is in combat with some who have died what that's like. We're going to take a quick break and come back and ask you to share with us. Again, you're not getting the knock on the door like a family member would get with that notification, but you're now the commander of almost 300, and you've lost more than a dozen, and the rest are still feeling that loss far away from home. We'll be right back. All right, Craig, can you tell us what's your proverbial knock on the door? You're the commander. You now know you've lost these 5 from your unit, the other passengers from other units. You're still in the middle of a deployment that has, 8 months left? You don't get to go home and process this. You've got to stay mission focused, but you can't possibly be immune to the emotion and the loss of this. Can you tell us that point of view? It's not anything we've ever heard before.
Yeah, so I certainly was not immune to the emotion. It still gets me emotional now. I knew every single one of these crew members. I knew their stories. I knew their background. So that certainly weighs on you that you've lost 18 total under your watch. I think the immediate concern that I had was not only taking care of the families back home, but certainly caring for the soldiers that were in the fight, quote unquote. We had still about 8 months left in our deployment. The mission still had to continue. And how did I keep everybody focused, but also give them the space and the opportunity to mourn the loss of their brothers and sisters in arms? So that was my focus for the immediate period after that, along with, great officers and NCOs that were with me through that deployment. And quite frankly, the entire unit of soldiers who really showed their incredible resilience. We talk about that word resilience, but I think it's very appropriate in the days when the accident happened and the days after the accident. So I'm not going to lie. There's no script. There's no playbook when this happens because every tragedy is different and every accident is different.
Well, and you're dealing with, and I'm sorry to interrupt, but you're also dealing with the loss with fellow soldiers that are grieving that, and everyone grieves so differently. So the amount of different nuances to this entire thing, like the military can't possibly write a book for this.
Right.
That's right. And there isn't one. So, I always, if you watch Saving Private Ryan, when they're at the bridge and they're getting taken overrun at the bridge, and Tom Hanks's character turns to his sergeant and he goes, "What do I do?"
Yeah.
I mean, I'm not going to lie. I mean, that was a conversation that I had with my first sergeant was, "First sergeant, what do I do?" Those are those intimate conversations that you have. You don't certainly show that to, you have to be strong and lead, right? But there is that, I'm not going to lie, there's this inner voice. And luckily I had a great relationship with my senior NCO, first sergeant, and we were able to have those conversations. And, we both agreed we need to continue the mission for this legacy of our soldiers that we lost. And they would want that. If they were in the same boat, they would continue the mission like we did. And so I, had long conversations with leadership. I probably had more than what they wanted to have conversations with the whole company, where I, stood on a Humvee or stood on a pedestal, and so I could see them and look at them and hug them and love them, and just to make sure that they were doing right. So
it breaks my heart to picture that. Again, we've talked with a lot of people about what it's like to get the news of an Army loss or military loss at home. But I can't imagine like Michelle said, it's not just one family. You've got 300 people grieving independently and differently, but have to get up and go to work in the morning. Craig, I love that you mentioned resilience. What has your personal Army journey taught you about resilience, including this experience, and then also the years before and after this experience as you've worn that uniform for our country?
I always kind of go back. I'm kind of a geek when it comes to like words and what they mean. And in physics, resilience is the ability, of a elastic type of material to absorb energy. I love that idea or analogy, absorbing energy and releasing that energy as it springs back to its original shape. And, that's analogous to, a person's ability to bounce back, after such a horrific situation. And Jennie and Michelle, you both have experienced that loss. But it's not easy. Grief, even now, 17 years later, it hits me.
We can hear it in your voice. We're feeling it with you.
Yeah. Grief it's not linear, right? Loss is not linear. It hits you. You can have an experience or smell, and it comes back. So understanding that and finding a network of people. I know on your podcast you talk about family and leaning on folks and not being embarrassed to ask for help. I think that's part of this resiliency that you're talking about. We just had a gathering of family members and soldiers at our memorial event that we do every year. It's a fundraising event for our organization. And, I talked about that. We were a family of 300, close to 300 soldiers. We were an extended family. And, I always tell folks, and Jennie, you've heard me comment on this before, is the Reverend or Bishop Desmond Tutu. He said, you don't get to choose your family. They are God's gift to you as you are to them. And it's kind of appropriate for this, is that we didn't choose this family to be in, but we're so darn happy to have them. And, that's where our resiliency comes, is to be able to ask for help and lean on each other and make sure that we're honoring legacy and telling the life stories of those that we lost, and getting to know the families of the 13 passengers that we lost, that we didn't know as a unit. I think that's important. I think it's important not only to learn from them, but also to hear their life stories.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. How beautiful to be able to share in their grief as well.
Yeah. And I love that you're able to share the stories that having served in the military. You can share what your 5 crew members were like. You can tell their children, their family members, and then you can also get to know the family members. I think it's such a beautiful two-way street here. We've only got a couple of minutes left here, Craig, and I just appreciate this story so much. I wish we had hours and hours to really... I've got 500 side questions. I want to know more. I want to get the details. But tell us, what does this memorial organization of yours look like? I know you call it the Windy 25 after that call sign of the helicopter. What do those gatherings look like each year? It's now been almost 2 decades. Who comes? What are those connections like? Can you kind of paint a visual picture of what you experienced recently at that most recent annual gathering and what that has felt like for the 2 decades since?
Yeah, so we were a close-knit group, we felt, when the accident happened. We continue to keep in touch, and through this organization that we've created called the Windy 25 Memorial Fund, we bring families of the accident together and have soldiers from the unit surround them and hug them and give them the love and tell stories, and in the spirit of never forget and remembrance and honor. And so every year we go to Vegas. Las Vegas was chosen because it's kind of an easy place to get to. Our unit was based in Germany, even though the accident happened in Afghanistan. So we had folks from all over the United States. So we really didn't have an anchor base in the United States to do an event from. So we chose Las Vegas. And so that's where we focused our efforts on an annual event. The Memorial Fund is designed to bring the families together and honor legacy in that way, where soldiers and families can come together and tell those stories and lean on each other and learn from each other, share stories. And Jennie, you're right. There's so many stories that I didn't even pick up, or families didn't even know about their loved one. That it's really inspiring to be able to see those connections being built in the community that's developed because of this organization work in bringing these families together to Vegas every year. It truly is a family, not necessarily like Desmond Tutu said, a family that we wanted or chose, but one that we're very grateful to have, that we can lean on each other. And so through this organization, we've also decided that we want to bring Gold Star families in that may not experience this family atmosphere, this connection, this community, to have them enjoy, and I use that word enjoy, the experience of remembrance and honor, to turn their tragedy into triumph in some way. We had a gentleman this year who we invited for the first time. His son passed away in Iraq, and he came up to the podium and he said, this was unscripted. He said, hey, for 7 years I had nobody. I didn't know anybody in my son's unit. I had nobody to talk to that understood what we were. And he goes, thank goodness for the Windy 25 Memorial Fund and for these Gold Star families that surround me and soldiers that surround me with the love that I need. And, that's what it's all about. And I think that's part of that resilience that you talk about, is asking for help and being available as somebody who's experienced loss to help others through that loss.
I love that, Craig, so much.
It's so beautiful.
Like you said, it's not an experience that you would have ever chosen, any of us. And yet you can take that trial and, like you use the physics analogy, you've absorbed the energy. Are you absorbing the energy as positive or destructive? And it sounds like you've definitely found ways to have that be a positive energy to enjoy. What a powerful word. We're going to enjoy the healing that comes through association, through storytelling, through gathering together, through asking for help and then receiving that help. I mean, you could write a book about the importance of that as it plays into resilience. So, Craig, thank you for sharing your time. I know you're busy in between these meetings. I will tell you one of the things that I love the most, and it might sound kind of backwards, I love that the emotion still hits you almost 2 decades later. I love that it can still feel new and raw and painful, because that means you haven't forgotten. And that, from my heart, is good to know. Another decade or 2 or 5 out for my own family and others who have experienced any kind of loss. We get stronger as we go. We get more adaptive. I think we do develop that resilience, but we don't ever become immune to the heart of it. And that's what I appreciate. Like I said, that very first meeting with you and so many other in the CASA field who have served in the military and not lost a biological family member, but lost a brother in arms, and in your case, far too many. So, Craig, thank you for sharing with us this very unique perspective. We'll put a link to your Memorial Fund's website so people can see the good work you do. I love seeing the photos you share each year as you gather for the couple of years I've known you, and just seeing these families coming together, grieving, but in a strong way. The strength of grief, the positive energy they're absorbing and bouncing back, and just grateful for what you've shared with us today. Sorry, Craig, was there something else you wanted to add?
I just wanted to thank both of you. What you're doing is also sharing in your vulnerability and your loss, and hopefully that is touching others. And, this podcast, I think, is incredible. And, I think people need to hear that it's okay to be vulnerable, and that in itself is being resilient. And so I just appreciate what you're doing. Jennie, you're a great friend. I appreciate it. And Michelle, I'd love to meet you one day.
Oh, I would love to meet you too. I actually wanted to say something before we ended, and that is to say, number one, to hear the emotion so many years later from you, knowing that you were the commander, but to hear that vulnerability in your voice, I appreciate that as a civilian who doesn't really understand the whole, I'm getting emotional, I'm starting to cry, who doesn't really understand the lifestyle of military. But, we watch these films on TV and we see people say, you got my six, you got me six. But I can hear it in your voice, and that you love these men. And I want to know that our men are loved and provided and cared for by their commanders. And so I appreciate the service that you've given and the vulnerability that you've shown the remaining men while you had to serve that final 8 months. I really appreciate it. And it's good to know that it's not just all, the Hollywood of it all.
Yeah. No, there's real heart there. And
there's real heart and real love.
And Craig, you're one of the best. And I know your fellow West Point classmates, I've now met many of you that have been through West Point and just years and years of military service. And I'm impressed with Michelle that under all the strength and the resilience and the toughness and the combat, you have hearts of gold. And I am very grateful for that.
Oh, thank you very much. I'm grateful for both of you.
All right, back to your meetings and go run a marathon if you have a few spare hours. Okay, thanks, Craig. Talk to you later.
Thank you all.
All righty. As always, to our listeners, we're grateful for you joining in with us, and thank you for sharing your time with us. And we're always looking for more stories to share. We know that everyone has a story, everyone has a path that they've walked. If you're listening and you're willing to share some of your real-life experiences with us, we'd love to have you reach out and find us at rrpodcast@ksl.com, or find us on Facebook or Instagram at Relentlessly Resilient Podcast.
Remember, whatever you do today, remember to be kind. You have no idea the struggles others are dealing with in their lives. Have a great day.
Take care, everybody.